Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Now we're going to move on to lesson number 15, in which the author rahimahullah talks about the issue of imama, meaning the issue regarding the imam in the mosque, or the imam for the congregational prayers. So in this section he's going to talk about the conditions that have to be met in order for a person to be a sound imam, or he's also going to talk about the conditions that have to be the recommended conditions. So there are two different types of conditions. One that is necessary in order for the prayer of those behind him to be sound, which are called the shurutul sihha, meaning that in order for the person's prayer to be sound, praying behind that imam, he has to fulfill such and such conditions. The shurutul kamal are the second category, which generally mean the conditions that are recommended to be there in order for the prayer to be receive the most benefit. But if one of these conditions were missed, the prayer would still be sound, but there is a deficiency in barakah. So the author goes on to say, وَمِن شُرُوطِ الْإِمَامِ أَن يَكُونَ ذَكَرًا مُسْلِمًا عَاقِلًا بَالِغًا عَالِمًا بِمَا لَا تَصِحُّ الصَّلَاةُ إِلَّا بِهِ مِنْ قِرَاءَةٍ وَفِقْهٍ. So the first thing that he says is that the shurutul imam, the conditions that have to be there, أن يكون ذكرًا. The first condition is that the imam has to be a male. Then he says Musliman, that the second condition is that the person has to be a Muslim. Aqilan, that the person has to be sane, meaning that he's not possessed by a jinn, or that he understands what he's performing, meaning that he doesn't have any mental deficiency that would necessitate that he doesn't know exactly what he's doing. Balighan, that he has reached the age of puberty. Aliman bima la tasihhu salatu illa bihi, and he has to be knowledgeable enough, or he has to know enough about the prayer, as he describes here, bima la tasihhu salatu illa bihi, meaning he has to know, he has to have the knowledge of the things that are necessary in order for the prayer to be sound. So basically he has to know what the obligatory acts are. And that's what it means by bima la tasihhu salatu illa bihi, meaning generally he has to be knowledgeable concerning the issues that relate to prayer. And that's why it says min qira'atin, in terms of recitation. So he has to be able to read Surah Al-Fatiha correctly, and has to know that he's reading correctly, wa fiqhin, and to know enough fiqh that he can be certain that his prayer is sound and that none of the necessary elements are missing from the prayer. So the author here mentioned all of these conditions, which necessitates, or which means that if one of any of these conditions that we just mentioned are not fulfilled, then the person praying behind him, his prayer would not be valid. So he's going to give us the result of that by saying, فَإِنِ اقْتَدَيْتَ بِإِمَامٍ ثم تبين لك أنه كافر أو امرأة أو خنثى مشكل أو مجنون أو فاسق بجارحة أو سبي لم يبلغ الحلم أو محدث تعمد الحدث بطلت صلاتك ووجبت عليك الإعادة. He says, if you were to follow a person or follow an imam, and thereafter ثم تبين لك أنه كافر, and then you were to find out that he was a disbeliever, or you were to find out that a woman was leading the prayer, أو خنثى مشكل. خنثى مشكل is a hermaphrodite, meaning a person who has both genitals of a man and a woman, but we cannot determine which one he is. Is he a man or a woman? Then his prayer would still be invalid. And the reason why he mentions that, because according to Fiqh, if we will know whether or not we're going to determine him a man or a woman, if depending on which genital he urinates out of consistently. So, but what he's referring to here is the khuntha mushkil, meaning the one that we cannot determine whether it will be a man or a woman. So that would also nullify the prayer. Aw majnoonun, or one who is majnoon, one that has been possessed or affected by a jinn or has a mental deficiency. Aw fasiqun bijarihatin. Aw fasiqun bijarihatin means generally what they're referring to here is not necessarily a sinner, but referring to a person who does not perform the prayer correctly. So fasiqun bijarihatin would be the opposite of a person who doesn't have the knowledge of, can't recite Surah Al-Fatiha properly, or cannot do the, or doesn't know the obligatory acts, but it doesn't refer to a person who's doing the kaba'ir. Then it says, أو سبي, or لم يبلغ الحلماء, or to follow a sabi, meaning a child before he reaches the age of puberty. أو محدث تعمد الحدث, or he followed a person, muhdithun, meaning an imam that broke his who broke his wudu intentionally. The reason why he's using the word intentionally, because there's a difference between an imam who broke his wudu intentionally and one who broke it just without unwillingly. So for example, the imam who broke his wudu unwillingly, then that would be another matter. But the person who broke his prayer on purpose just to break his prayer, then that would nullify the prayer. That's what he means by here, muhdithun ta'ammad al-hadatha batalat salatuka. So here what he's saying is that all of what we have mentioned, out of all of these people, if you're following behind them, then the prayer would be nullified. And the reason why they would be nullified is because it would automatically negate one of the conditions that we mentioned before. For example, we mentioned that a person has to be a male. Thus, if a person were to pray behind a female, whether a girl is praying behind a female or not, the prayer would be nullified. We said that if a person we found out that he was a disbeliever, then his prayer would be nullified because it negates the condition that the imam has to be a Muslim. Or we found out that we were praying behind somebody who was affected by a jinn, possessed by a jinn, or had a mental disorder, because it negates the condition that of being aqil, of being intelligent. Or we find ourselves praying behind a child who has not reached the age of puberty, then we break the condition that the person has to be the age of puberty. Or if we pray behind a person who's a fasiq bijarihatin, meaning a person who doesn't have the knowledge or doesn't have the knowledge to know or doesn't know what is sound from what is not sound, or does something that nullifies the prayer, or doesn't know how to recite the Fatiha properly, then that would negate the condition that the person has to be knowledgeable concerning these matters. Then he goes on now to talk about some of the things that are mustahab. وَيُسْتَحَبُّ سَلَامَةُ الْأَعْضَاءِ لِلْإِمَامِ. Here's a general rule that it is recommended that the imam be salamatul a'da'i lil-imami, meaning that the imam outwardly and physically, in terms of his body parts, are sound from any type of aib, any type of disorder. For example, as he's going to mention here, وَتُكْرَهُ إِمَامَةُ الْأَقْتَعِ وَالْأَشَلِّ وَصَاحِبِ السَّلَسِ, that it is disliked to have for a person to be an imam if he's aqta'i, meaning that he has a limb that's cut. So for example, an imam with one leg or an imam with one arm. And it should be understood that these are from the sifatul kamal, these are from the recommended attributes. And the reason for the ulama stipulating some of these things is because the imam is something that both inwardly and outwardly should be extremely pleasing for the people, because the imam represents it represents the people in the sense that they are the ones, he is the one who's leading the prayer daily. So, for example, just from people's own experience, a person can recognize the difference between praying behind somebody who they love and praying behind somebody who they dislike. So, for example, once a certain recognized scholar comes into town, you will notice that the people will come to the mosque because they enjoy praying with him. Or when he comes, the people may love him so much that maybe the local imam will say, hey, let him lead the prayer, because the people would love to pray behind him. So understanding the having an imam, when the imam is beloved both inwardly and outwardly to the people, then the congregation, people attend the congregation more, and there's a lot of blessings in the congregation for that reason, because the people like to complete the prayer with him being the imam. So some of the ulama, going back to the text, disliked imamatul aqta'i wal ashalli, that the imam is disliked for a person to be an imam that is has a severed limb, wal ashalli, or al ashalli means a person who has a severed genital, whether it's the testicles or it's actually the genital itself. And wasahib salasi, and then he mentions also that it is disliked for a person who has a problem with a salis. A salis refers to a person who, after urinating, for example, they usually break their wudu because some type of extra urine comes out involuntarily, to the point that it comes out so much that they're excused from making wudu. Like for a person that has constant drops of al-madhi, or constant drops of urine coming out, then under certain circumstances they're going to be relieved from making wudu. So in that case, they're saying it's makruh for a person to pray behind them if their state is sound. And I'll complete that part, because he's going to say now, وَمَنْ بِهِ كُرُوحٌ لِلسَّحِي. The next category is going to talk about a person who has kuruh, meaning a person who has a lot of pimples or a lot of acne on his face. It is disliked for them to be an imam lis-sahih, for a person who is sound. What he's saying here is that a person who has lots of acne on his face, it's disliked for him to be the imam for somebody who doesn't have that state. Now, what for the common person it might be difficult to understand, but the general spirit of what is being mentioned here is that the imam should be somebody that both outwardly and inwardly is beloved to the people. So even in terms of looks, in terms of behavior, in terms of everything, any deficiency in the characteristics of such a person will defect the prayer of the people following behind him. So he mentioned a couple of things here, which, as we mentioned first, one who's severed, or one who has a severed limb, or one who has one of their genitals are cut, or the person who has a salis, or a person who has lots of acne lis-sahih. The sound opinion is, in regards of the one who has a severed limb, or the one who is ashalli, the one who has the severed genital, the scholars say that the relied upon opinion is that it is not disliked. Then he's going to go on to mention some more things that are disliked. He says, "Wa imamatu man yukrahu." Also, he says it's disliked for a person to be an imam if he's disliked in his community. But obviously disliked for religious reasons, not disliked because somebody has hasad. So if he's generally disliked, for example, an imam who was known to to have a bad business deal with somebody, and he ripped him off or something like that, or an imam who belittles the sunnah, for example, or anything in which the community, in terms of religious matter, dislike the person for that reason, due to some incident in the past, then it is disliked for him to be the imam. وَيُكْرَهُ لِلْخَسِيِّ وَالْأَغْلَفِ وَالْمَعْبُونِ وَمَجْهُولِ الْحَالِ وَوَلَدِ الزِّنَا وَالْعَبْدِ فِي الْفَرِيدَةِ. Then he says there are some things in which my bad. والعبد في الفريضة أن يكون إماما راتبا بخلاف النافلة فإنها لا تكره بواحد منهم. Now he's going to mention some things in which it's disliked for such a person to be a designated imam. So there's a difference of opinion. There's two different things here. We have the designated imam and we have the regular imam. What do we mean by the regular imam? Just any random person. When you become an imam ratib means that you're imam in a masjid for a fixed amount of prayers every day. What he was talking about in the first category were just imams in general, meaning even being imam for a single prayer. The ones that he's going to mention now means that it's only disliked to be an imam ar-ratib, meaning to be a designated imam in a mosque if you have these characteristics in which he's going to talk about now. The first one he mentions, وَيُكْرَهُ لِلْخَسِيِّ. Al-khasiyi is a person whose genital is cut. Meaning a person whose genital is cut, either the actual thing itself or just one of his testicles. As they mentioned in the books of fiqh, that's who al-khasi is. Wal-aghlafi is a person who is uncircumcised. So a person who's uncircumcised. Wal-ma'buni is a person, as ulama mentioned, a person who is, I guess we can translate as a sissy, because they say man yatakasiru fi kalamihi kan nisa, like a male who speaks like a female. Some people are born a little feminine, not necessarily mean that they're homosexuals, but they're born feminine, meaning that when they talk, they make hand gestures and they speak in a manner which is feminine. Then it is disliked to make them designated imams. Some of the ulama define al-ma'bun also as a person who, wa'udhu billahi, and you seek refuge from it, that a person who has a desire to do a homosexual act, walakin he didn't do it. For example, he has an impulse. So that person would also be disliked to have as a designated imam. وَمَجْهُولِ الْحَالِ meaning somebody who's unknown. So for example, somebody who's unknown to the community, it's also disliked for them to be the imam because his integrity is not confirmed. وَوَلَدَ الزِّنَا, somebody who is born out of wedlock. It is also disliked for a person who is born out of wedlock, meaning that they were born before marriage, or that they were born as meaning they were born out of wedlock. It is also disliked for them to be the imam wal abdi, and it is also disliked for an imam to be the for a slave to be an imam. And he says fil faridati, and these things that we're mentioning is in terms is in relation to obligatory prayers, and yakuna imaman ratiban, and this is limited, as I mentioned to you before, to being an imam, a designated imam, which means that for a single prayer, then there wouldn't be any problem. For example, a random prayer, like people who came in the masjid and there was no one there, and one of these people were led to be the imam, because the fact that they're only doing it one time is not much of a big deal, but when they become designated imams, then it's considered disliked. And it says بِخِلَافِ النَّافِلَةِ, contrary to nafilati, فَإِنَّهَا لَا تُكْرَهُ بِوَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمْ. But in terms of nafila referring to any of those prayers, any of those congregational prayers which are not obligatory, a nafila like Eid, that's considered a nafila, then it is not disliked for one of these people to be an imam. So that's why it says فَإِنَّهَا لَا تُكْرَهُ بِوَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمْ.